Hi everyone. Now that I've unmuted myself, I'd like to introduce you to the penultimate workshop in our Agile Initiative Research Planning Workshop series. And today we're going to have a look at what does interdisciplinarity look like in Agile sprints. So I'm just going to move on to some introductions and housekeeping. If you give me half a minute. Here we go, got it. Right. So the first thing I need to flag is that unfortunately Dr. Mark Hirons, who is supposed to be the co-lead today, is unable to participate. So I'm very lucky to say that my colleague Rachel Heyman has agreed to be my unofficial co-pilot for this workshop with me. So Rachel's going to help out with answering questions, setting up polls, that kind of thing. So Rachel and I are both part of what we call the Agile Engine Room, which is the program support team who keep Agile moving and capture the learning on our sprints and the Agile model. So Rachel is the program manager and I'm the impact facilitator. I'm going to attempt to try to keep this as jargon-free as possible, but do please be aware that I may refer to Agile instead of the Agile Initiative and IDR instead of interdisciplinary research. I also at points refer to non-traditional outputs, which encompass a range of non-academic outputs such as guidance, technical reports, policy and research briefs. These are in contrast to the usual academic outputs such as journal papers. But basically, if there are any terms that I use that you don't understand, please feel free to flag these in the chat as you go along. And I should also mention that as this is part of Agile's research planning workshop series, it is primarily geared towards those seeking to get involved in Agile, but I very much hope for the rest of you that there will be enough transferable learning to make this interesting and worthwhile. And also that we'd love to hear about your experiences of interdisciplinary research and working with an interdisciplinary team. So in our first section, we're going to have a look at the background and principles which define the way that interdisciplinarity is embedded in Agile and the sprint model. Within this section, we'll conduct a quick poll and we'll have a section at the end for some answers just to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And then in our second bit, we're going to draw on the learning from 4 of our pioneer sprints that were in the original proposal and are now complete, to extrapolate when and how interdisciplinarity needs to be designed into the sprint and how ongoing interdisciplinarity can work best in practice. The third section then focuses on how to put this learning into practice when planning for a sprint. And then we've got some discussion questions for you to reflect and respond to. And then right at the end, we'll share some concluding principles. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the first section, which is the background and principles. And this is going to cover what drives interdisciplinarity in Agile, how it's conceptualized, and the key interdisciplinary research challenge in Agile sprints. So this slide effectively charts the relationship between the overarching mission, how that's conceptualized via the pillars, which for those of you in the know were previously referred to as the goals and are essentially the work packages within the programme. What you can see from this little diagram is that interdisciplinary research is integral to each of these pillars. The one this workshop focuses on is sprints. However, by being part of a sprint, you are also part of our drive to increase the number of researchers in the university who are capable of transcending disciplinary boundaries. Why does this matter? Because Agile seeks to deliver the socio-environmental research results to answer urgent policy questions, and policy spans a range of considerations that rarely only rely on one academic discipline. Perpetuating the Agile sprint model is part of the culture shift we hope to bring about in the university. And finally, learning from sprints and the policy relevant interdisciplinary research undertaken will be used to contribute to shifting the dial on recognising the value of interdisciplinary academic work and addressing the structural changes needed to better support its practice and its funding and its delivery. Right, so just to move on. This is basically to look at how we define interdisciplinarity in Agile. So what I've done here is I've included some standard definitions of the type of research that strays beyond one discipline and how they relate to Agile. So just to very quickly run through these standard definitions for reference. Cross-disciplinary research refers to 2 or more academic disciplines, and the insights can either be juxtaposed or a more integrated approach can be taken. Multidisciplinary research provides input from other disciplines into an existing academic discipline. And interdisciplinary research, in its more rigid understanding of the term, synthesizes knowledge and methodology from different disciplines to create new knowledge that is more than the sum of its parts. And transdisciplinary research is a strategy that transcends normal academic thinking and brings non-academic stakeholder input in to solve problems. So, having said all that, I can clarify that with the blessing of our funders, the Natural Environment Research Council, we don't stick to a very prescriptive definition of interdisciplinarity. Instead, we use interdisciplinarity as the umbrella term, encompassing the separate definitions above, to reflect that sprint questions and sprint size will largely determine the approach taken to interdisciplinary research. Nonetheless, we do emphasise the need for integration. This doesn't necessarily mean, however, that we're expecting the degree of synthesis under the more rigid definition of interdisciplinarity or a commitment to using mixed methods research. But our emphasis in Agile on ongoing co-creation with stakeholders and effectively answering the sprint's question means that if 5 disciplines are involved, the decision makers are less likely to be interested in 5 different answers embedded within their respective disciplinary parameters. And sprint interdisciplinarity, importantly, also brings in elements of transdisciplinary research, as the ongoing co-creation enables you to draw on stakeholder knowledge, expertise and requirements for easy-to-use, decision-maker-focused, non-traditional outputs to meet the policy need, underpinned by robust academic research. So, having given you all of that information, we're now going to move on to a very quick poll that I'm lucky to say my colleague is going to arrange for me. And this is just to get a sense of who in the room has had, what you're most familiar with in terms of these particular definitions of interdisciplinary research. Okay, so what I'm going to move on to now, if I can get the slide to advance, here we go. So, a key Agile IDR challenge, time constraints. It's fair to say there's a number of challenges with interdisciplinary research in general. However, for an Agile sprint, a key challenge is the timing. A sprint is short and it attempts to do something, i.e. interdisciplinary research, that normally takes longer than discipline-specific research, and it attempts to do this in an expedited timescale. We expect sprints to produce a primary non-traditional output supported by an academic paper published in an open access peer-reviewed journal. However, publishing still takes time, as peer review and responding to reviewer feedback are time-consuming. Also, not all of the gold standard open access journals are willing to publish interdisciplinary papers. However, I should note that as part of our commitment to culture change, Agile has been in conversation with the nature journals on the potential to expedite their review processes and incorporating more interdisciplinarity within their journals. But even so, it's unlikely that a paper submitted during the sprint will be published before the sprint ends, although I should add that targeting preprint friendly journals can mitigate this to an extent. Therefore, this time constraints challenge needs to be taken into account within the context of the sprint in the initial thinking, the design and the proposal. So this is our learning from Agile sprints so far. So now that we've looked at the background principles, here's some of the information that we've collated from what we term our pioneer sprints. This slide is basically 4 of our completed pioneer sprints. And the summary of the main disciplinary composition of the team, which reflected how the sprint question was addressed from an academic perspective. However, what I really want to point out with this particular table is that the 2 middle columns taken together represent the expertise that guided the interdisciplinary research and shaped the primary outputs designed to influence policy and for ease of use for decision makers. I'm also going to point out that since we've just been talking about outputs to an extent, that the ones I've listed are not the only outputs for these sprints. The top 3 also produced academic papers, guidance and policy briefs. The NBS Knowledge Hub is a sort of a one-stop shop for all the guidance and tools they generated for the assessment, planning and design and implementation of best practice nature-based solutions. And the final sprint listed is shortly going to be producing a policy brief, which is the sort of truncated, decision maker friendly findings from the research paper that's listed here. So if you look at this taken together, to date, Agile Interdisciplinarity has spanned the natural, physical and social sciences as defined by the policy pool and the sprint question. What I want to make very clear, however, is this doesn't mean that medical sciences and humanities are excluded from the breadth of interdisciplinarity for future sprints. Okay, so having looked at these, I'm just going to move on to what we have learnt from our sprints in terms of interdisciplinary teamwork. So once the interdisciplinary research has been designed into the sprint and reflected in the researchers on the team, the key stakeholders and the sprint partners, it also needs to be factored into the ongoing sprint teamwork. And each of the 4 sprints on the previous slide had regular weekly or fortnightly team meetings, as well as several stakeholder workshops throughout the sprint. What I'm focusing on here is the team approach to interdisciplinary working, drawing on reflections and learning that we've captured during the sprint milestone meetings. So if I can get this to work. The first example is from a sprint with an ambitious scope and a large team, not all of whom were able to regularly meet in person in Oxford. However, they very quickly established a good team dynamic, and co-working between weekly meetings was largely done via Slack, which allowed for regular input from sprint partners and key stakeholders. To establish common understanding between disciplines and keep the overall project in focus, team members and work packages presented to each other in the team meetings. In this way, they proactively sought to establish connecting threads between the work packages and research streams, enabling good understanding of the interrelated dependencies and compensating for delays. So in the example of this sprint, they had a delay in their social welfare team, which was held up by a QREC ethical approval process. So the second example, this team had 2 researchers who acted as internal coordinators. So they were the liaison point between the sprint and the stakeholders, and also the liaison point between the work packages and the different disciplines within the sprint. So in effect, they kind of acted as translators. And this was important to this team because the PDRAs had staggered start times, and the liaison enabled new members of the team to be brought up to speed quite quickly. On top of this, the way the work packages were designed was that they were interwoven, and the regular team meetings reinforced the connection between them and the overarching sprint objective. So that was always kept in the forefront of those meetings. At the start of the sprint, the team agreed on a shared understanding of the problem definition underpinning the research question, and regular in-person team meetings enabled the creation of a common language between the disciplines. So what I mean by that specifically is where the terminology may vary in one discipline to another in its understanding, all of that kind of thing. So agreeing the terminology that was going to be used and understood by the sprint. It should also be noted for this example that this smaller team had pre-existing working relationships between the co-Is. All were based in Oxford, and the key departments were physically close to each other, all of which helped to establish an ongoing in-person working dynamic. Okay. So on the third example, you might just pick up on the fact that the language is slightly different, as this reflects the wisdom of retrospect and what the team would have done differently. So what I'm going to emphasize here very strongly is that this was ultimately a successful sprint, but it had a large team, an ambitious scope and objectives, and they also went to tremendous efforts to leap on any ad hoc policy opportunities that arose during the sprint. It managed to pull all of the expertise together in a multidisciplinary portfolio of outputs to address the varying ways high quality NBS could be scaled up in the UK. And they managed this very ambitious project for very rigorous project management and regular workshops that brought in expertise from a vast range of stakeholders. However, the ambition did put a lot of pressure on the team, and in hindsight, they would have redesigned the interdisciplinarity in the sprint to give equal weight between both the social and the natural science approaches, and reframed the objectives to better enable cross-work package integration. So their takeaway learning point is therefore to develop realistic objectives that support an evidence-led, theoretically informed plan for IDR outputs prior to inception. So to move on to my final example, this is another smaller team with a more targeted scope. And what enabled the IDR in this instance was close alignment between the disciplines that shared the same intended meaning for key terminology, that all team members had previous experience working within shipping decarbonisation, which was the topic of the sprint. This team enhanced the transdisciplinarity aspect through a policy liaison officer role that created a strong ongoing two-way dialogue within the sprint team and the Department for Transport. So that was one of the researchers who had this dual role within the sprint. Now, I'm just going to reflect on these examples for a moment. The factors that can't reliably be emulated are the pre-existing working relationships, the natural alignment between the component disciplines, and team member proximity and the capacity for in-person meetings. However, the factors that can be emulated to enable interdisciplinary teamwork are establishing a good team dynamic through shared understanding of the sprint enterprise and what it hopes to achieve, interrelated work packages that are not discipline specific, coordination and liaison roles embedded within the team, giving equal weight to the approaches and methodologies between the main disciplines involved, and designing objectives that allow for cross-work package collaboration, and planning for a primary interdisciplinary output from the outset, which takes us on to our next slide. So this again is based on some of our learning on the problems encountered by some of the sprints. I should emphasise that these did not lead to the catastrophic collapse or the failure of the sprint, but put a lot of pressure on the researchers and the sprint deadlines, and they were mostly the result of overambitious plans. While I've emphasised that we try not to be too prescriptive in our definition of interdisciplinarity, the first 2 points are the ways you can potentially capsize yourself. So just to look at them in turn. In small teams with few disciplines, it can seem to make sense to have a work package per discipline. I'd say, however, unless this is unavoidable, we don't advise it. It can limit researcher development for those new to interdisciplinarity and create problems in team communication and planning for an interdisciplinary output. If it is unavoidable, it can be mitigated by clear channels of communication and intersection points between the work packages, facilitated by regular team meetings and a sprint communications channel such as Slack or Teams. I'd also like to point out that last minute integration can be problematic. That's something you really need to think about very early on. Some sprints have needed to pivot based on changes in the policy landscape, and that has changed the plans for integrated outputs. While this is outside of the sprint's control, having an integrated work practice throughout sprints will make it easier to manage the pivot and quickly galvanise on a different type of output to meet the changing need. And on the last minute integration, I'm going to add a word of caution as well, which is that don't assume by having one social scientist on your team that they will be the person who magically brings together all the integration at the last minute. This is unrealistic, unfair, and they really won't thank you for it. So sprints ultimately rely on ongoing interdisciplinary working. This can be effectively achieved through planning for fewer work packages that have clear interrelationships and intersection points with a clear team communication to mitigate slippages. Okay, so up till now, I've mostly sort of looked at the ways in which the warning side of things. So I'm now going to focus on some of the benefits. And these quotes on the screen were directly harvested from our early career researchers from our pioneer sprints. And I think they demonstrate that interdisciplinarity working brings benefits to the individual's development, the team's development, outputs and outcomes for stakeholders, and the sprint itself. So please bear with me if things have been a little bit negative up to now. I do promise you that actually this endeavour is ultimately worthwhile. So I'm now going to move on to the next section. And this looks at how you can incorporate learning from sprints and put it into practice. Okay, so how do you start thinking about putting all of this into practice? Sprints are short, on average 12 months, compared to a standard 3 to 5 year research project. This means that newly assembled sprint teams need to hit the ground running in terms of planning their interdisciplinary research to avoid creating a portfolio response to the sprint question from the specific disciplines involved. Based on our learning to date, these are some of the factors that enhance planning for and being able to start working as an interdisciplinary team from the outset. So I'm just going to take this in turn. So to look at the first one, what's a problem definition in a sprint? I've used the term problem definition a couple of times already, but in short, it's just another way of saying what's the research question we're all seeking to answer in this sprint. It relates loosely to the problem definition in some conceptualizations of the policy cycle, which involves determining exactly what the problem is that policy is needed for before moving on to the policy formulation and implementation. In this context, it's a case of ensuring that all involved in the sprint, including stakeholders, sprint partners, are all on board and understand the sprint question, and that the parameters for research will be undertaken to answer the question effectively, ensuring everyone understands the overarching objectives and their role within the planned research. Okay, so to look at integration from the outset, this is a practical response to ensure that all the relevant disciplines and work packages are working together, are properly interlinked, and have a clear understanding that the goal is to generate actionable, easy to use outputs for decision makers that integrate the results. This effectively means not presenting each work package separately in the primary non-traditional and academic outputs, but integration can be as loose as layered results under thematic subsections or as methodological as fully planned mixed methods research. To look at the last column here, creating a common shared language, as I touched on when we were answering the questions, this is very important, as it's possible that not everybody planning to be part of a sprint or specifically recruited onto a sprint will have had the same level of experience of interdisciplinarity. Some people will have been recruited based on a very specific area of expertise needed within the sprint, and these people may have no prior experience of working as part of an interdisciplinary team. As I mentioned previously, some of the key terms mean different things in different disciplines, so it can be very easy to talk across purposes. And in turn, terminology used in disciplines may mean something entirely different to stakeholders. Therefore, it's extremely useful within a sprint to have a working sprint definition of some key terms so that everyone is using the same language and, importantly, everyone gets to feel heard. So these are what I would condense down to the core ingredients for a manageable, ongoing interdisciplinary research in an agile sprint. So the first one is obviously that the disciplines needed are very, very much defined by the policy relevant research question and decision maker requirements. The next one is thinking about the design of your interdisciplinarity. Are the objectives realistic? And this relates very much to the second point as well. Do the objectives reflect the work packages working together coherently? Are those work packages interwoven? In other words, are you thinking about things in a kind of interrelated way from the outset? It's very helpful to keep the research on track and focused by aligning the objectives with the cross-work package collaboration. And it really does help to stop the sprints becoming too fragmentary. And the last ones listed here relate to structuring the team and team working to allow for a dynamic team, which we've discussed, with a shared understanding of the endeavour and each other's perspectives. And all of these factors that relate to sort of methods of working lead us very neatly into the last workshop in the series, Leading and Managing an Agile Sprint, which will be this time next week.